You often hear discussions about the big problems facing the world, framed through political ideologies, left versus right, that kind of thing.
Right, it's the standard lens.
But what if we look at something maybe more fundamental, something that sort of cuts across those divides?
Okay, like what?
Like, what happens when powerful entities, doesn't matter what they say they believe, just refuse to admit they messed up, especially when those mistakes were, driven by chasing profits.
Okay. The denial factor when money is involved.
Exactly. That's the focus of our deep dive today. We've got a range of sources that really dig into the global consequences of this denial, especially in big economic relationships like, say, the U.S. and China.
That's a huge area, definitely.
So our mission is pretty straightforward. Understand the real impact of this lack of accountability on a world, sure, but also what does it actually mean for you for everyday life?
Got it. How does the big picture filter down?
Precisely. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's definitely a crucial area. And what's really striking, I think, is the consistency you see. Doesn't matter the system.
How so?
Well, when admitting you got something wrong might actually hurt the bottom line, that instinct to defend or deflect or just ignore it. It's remarkably strong. Doesn't matter if it's a state-run enterprise or a private corporation.
Absolutely. And maybe one of the biggest consequences, the most far-reaching, is just how it eats away at trust on a global scale.
Yeah, trust is fundamental.
And it's not just some, abstract idea, is it? It has real, tangible effects on, say, the stability of the whole global economy.
Definitely.
I mean, think back to the 2008 global financial crisis.
Yeah.
It's a really stark example, even if it's painful to revisit.
Oh, absolutely. What's fascinating when we look back at that period is how the years leading up to it were full of praise for deregulation.
Right. Loosening the rules.
Yeah, basically letting financial institutions take more risks, chase higher profits, and all those complex financial products, they were hailed as brilliant innovations for growth.
Everyone was getting rich, or so it seemed, on paper. Anyway.
Exactly, on the surface. But then the housing bubble burst. And because global finance was so interconnected, boom, the fallout spread incredibly fast worldwide. Devastating.
And yeah, sure, there were investigations afterwards. Some people admitted some failures. But you have to wonder, don't you, if there'd been an earlier, more honest admission of the systemic risks.
The risks baked into the system itself.
Yeah, and admitting that maybe chasing those short-term gains was prioritized over stability, maybe we could have reacted quicker, more effectively.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that lack of immediate, widespread accountability, it cast a really long shadow.
How so?
Public confidence in banks and regulators, it just plummeted, took a massive hit. And the economic hardship that followed, it dragged on for years for so many people.
Yeah, it wasn't a quick recovery for most.
No, it unleashed this wave of instability. And honestly, it's still shaping our economic landscape today in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it really does highlight how that initial unwillingness to say, hang on, this is dangerous, fueled by those huge potential profits, it ultimately caused much greater losses and this lasting skepticism.
Precisely. A deep skepticism towards the systems meant to govern our economies.
Okay, so that's the trust angle. But this relentless pursuit of profit, it can also lead to some pretty serious financial messes. Legal tangles, things that really stir up international tensions, maybe even conflict.
Oh, definitely. When the drive for profit leads to actions with really negative consequences, especially if those cross borders, it almost inevitably strains relationships between countries.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, think about multinational corporations extracting resources in, say, developing nations.
Right, mining, oil, timber. We've seen this play out so many times, haven't we?
We have. The pull of cheap resources, the potential for massive profits. Sometimes it incentivizes companies to, let's say, cut corners, adopt practices that cause serious environmental damage or social disruption in the places they operate.
And then what happens when they get called out?
What's fascinating here is the typical playbook. Often it's denial. We didn't do anything wrong. Or maybe downplaying it. It wasn't that bad.
Right. Minimize the impact.
Exactly. And this often escalates. You get legal battles, international arbitration, maybe serious diplomatic friction between the company's home country and the nation where the damage occurred.
And sadly, sometimes it goes beyond friction, doesn't it? We've seen in parts of Africa, the Middle East, this intense competition for resources driven by corporate and national economic interests. It can actually fuel regional instability, even conflict.
It's a stark reminder of how profit motives can have these profound destabilizing geopolitical effects. A fight for resources, fundamentally.
And it's crucial to remember who often pays the highest price.
Absolutely. It's so often the average people living in those resource-rich countries. They're the ones left dealing with the polluted environment, the social upheaval, maybe long-term health issues, while the profits, they frequently flow right out of the country.
It's a deeply unfair dynamic.
Yeah.
And sticking with this idea of image, this need to maintain a positive narrative, we're successful, we're strong, that can also block progress on really critical global challenges, right?
For sure. It becomes a major impediment. The climate crisis is probably the most obvious, most urgent example right now.
How so?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of climate change, think about industries heavily invested in fossil fuels. For decades, we've seen resistance.
Yeah. Pushing back against the science.
Driven by the enormous profitability of their existing setup, right?
Yeah.
There's been this sustained effort to downplay the science or reject it outright, to resist the urgent need for a shift to renewables.
And that resistance, it's often framed differently, isn't it? Like, we're defending the economy, protecting jobs, national interests.
Exactly. That's the narrative. But the deep irony, of course, is that the longer we delay real action because of those short-term profit concerns, the worse the consequences get for everyone. Long-term well-being gets sacrificed.
Classic short-term gain, long-term pain.
Pretty much. And what's fascinating here is just the sheer scale of those consequences. We're talking rising sea levels, more extreme weather, disrupting food supplies, forcing people to migrate.
These aren't future threats anymore, are they?
No, they're current realities.
Wow.
And they're already hitting the most vulnerable communities the hardest around the globe. So that refusal to acknowledge the long-term costs, all for immediate profit, it's having devastating global impacts right now.
It really hammers home how that focus on narrative, on not admitting that maybe a super profitable industry is fundamentally unsustainable. It actively undermines our ability to solve these huge existential threats.
It absolutely does.
Now, sometimes these profit motives get tangled up with politics, with like deep-seated ideological beliefs.
Right.
And that can make things even worse, maybe reinforcing global inequality.
Oh, completely. Sticking rigidly to a particular political ideology can create blind spots. A reluctance to admit when policies, even if they fit the ideology, are having negative outcomes.
Even when the evidence is right there.
Even then. The whole debate around global trade agreements is a good example, I think.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, on one side, you have the arguments for free trade, more efficiency, lower prices for consumers, stimulates growth overall, and those arguments can sound really compelling.
They often do. Cheaper goods, more choice.
But then you have the criticisms. Job losses in developed countries as manufacturing moves, potential for exploiting labor in developing countries where standards are lower, environmental corners cut. And those criticisms are also very real.
So where does the denial come in?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, there's often this reluctance, especially among proponents of, say, pure free market ideology, to really concede that while it might have benefits, it can also create significant losers, real harm for certain groups or regions.
An unwillingness to acknowledge the downsides of the preferred system.
Exactly. And that refusal to grapple with the potential harms can breed resentment, social unrest, maybe fuel protectionism, and ultimately strain international relations. Nations feel like they're getting a raw deal.
And again, who feels the impact most directly?
As usual, it's often the average person caught in those economic shifts, their livelihoods disrupted.
It seems like once an ideological path is set, admitting any bumps or negative consequences that challenge that ideology becomes incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Especially if powerful financial interests are benefiting from keeping things as they are.
That alignment of ideology and financial interest is incredibly powerful.
Which brings us to those really established industries, massive entities, maybe around for decades, who just resist admitting any harm purely to protect those huge ongoing profits.
The tobacco industry is probably the most chilling textbook example of this, isn't it?
Absolutely.
What's fascinating here and terrifying, really, is the sheer scale and the duration of the denial for decades.
Decades.
Despite overwhelming scientific evidence linking smoking to cancer, heart disease, lung disease, all sorts of deadly conditions. The companies actively denied it or, downplayed the risks. The science isn't settled, that kind of thing.
Their priority was crystal clear, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Maintaining profits, even at the cost of millions upon millions of lives.
And the tactics they used, the lobbying, the funding of skewed research, the PR campaigns, deliberately sowing doubt.
It's a stark reminder of how far entrenched interests will go to protect their bottom line. The human cost was just immense. Preventable deaths, massive healthcare burdens worldwide.
It makes you wonder how many other industries might be using similar tactics today.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it took decades of relentless public health campaigning, incredibly tough legal fights, and increasingly strict government regulations to even begin to turn the tide on smoking in many places.
It wasn't easy.
Not at all. It shows just how hard it is to overcome that kind of deep-rooted, profitable resistance, even when the evidence of harm is just undeniable.
A truly sobering thought. And, in today's world, things are so interconnected, so complex. Does that complexity sometimes make it easier to avoid accountability? Like, who's actually responsible when things go wrong?
That's a really important point, this idea of diffusion of responsibility. The complexity of global systems can absolutely obscure who's accountable, and that can enable exploitation.
How does that work in practice?
Think about the global supply chains of big multinational corporations. They're incredibly intricate.
Yeah, components from here, assembly there, materials from somewhere else.
Exactly. This vast network of suppliers, subcontractors, it can make it genuinely difficult sometimes to pin down who's responsible for, say, labor conditions or environmental standards at every single step.
So the main company can just point fingers down the chain.
Precisely. They can often claim they weren't directly involved or that it's the supplier's responsibility in another country. It creates distance.
A convenient distance, maybe?
Yeah.
It lets them benefit from, say, lower costs in places with weaker regulations or lower wages.
Without having to directly acknowledge or fix the potential harm happening further down their own supply chain.
Yes. What's fascinating here is the very real human impact of that.
Absolutely. The average workers, often in countries far away, can end up in really precarious jobs. Shockingly low pay, unsafe conditions. The complexity of the whole system allows that exploitation to continue, often hidden from view, all serving the goal of maximizing profit for the corporation at the very top.
Wow. Okay, this really does loop back strongly to what we mentioned earlier about the U.S.-China relationship, doesn't it?
It does.
This reluctance, maybe on both sides, to fully see or admit mutual benefits, maybe driven by a desire for dominance or just short-term profit grabs.
Yeah.
It can have these massive global ripple effects. Let's connect those dots more directly.
Okay, so if we connect this directly to the U.S.-China dynamic, if either side refuses to fully recognize the potential for a more, let's say, balanced, mutually beneficial economic relationship.
Because they're focused on maintaining dominance.
Yeah.
Or grabbing immediate financial advantage.
Right, that kind of zero-sum thinking or prioritizing short-term gain, it can lead to major disruptions globally. We've seen it.
Yeah, we definitely have. Trade disputes, terrorists, tech wars. How does that actually hit the average person, though, around the world?
Well, those trade disputes, the tariffs, they mess up established global supply chains almost instantly. Meaning higher prices for consumers everywhere as the cost of imported goods or goods with imported components goes up. Businesses also face huge uncertainty, which often means they pull back on investment, maybe cut jobs. And that's not just in the U.S. and China, but in all the other economies linked into those chains.
So it has a domino effect.
A significant one. And looking beyond just the dollars and cents, this reluctance to see potential common ground, it spills over into geopolitics too, doesn't it? Creates a more tense, maybe more dangerous world.
Seems like it.
Absolutely. When the world's biggest powers view each other mainly as competitors with suspicion, maybe fueled by that zero-sum thinking or chasing unilateral advantage, it just ramps up geopolitical tension, leading to more military spending, maybe proxy conflicts in different regions, just a general feeling of global instability. And all of that creates economic uncertainty, fear, and yeah, the very real potential for actual direct conflict, which would obviously impact average people everywhere catastrophically.
And maybe the scariest part is how this competitive, profit-first mindset gets in the way of tackling the really big problems, the ones that need everyone working together.
That's arguably the most damaging consequence.
Like climate change, pandemics.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how that inability or unwillingness to prioritize shared global well-being over narrow national interests or corporate profits, it just completely undermines the collaboration we desperately need.
You can't solve climate change country by country.
You simply can't. And the consequences of failing to act together, the worsening climate crisis, the risk of future pandemics spreading faster, who suffers most, it's always the most vulnerable populations across the whole planet.
It really brings home that point you made earlier about the similarity of greed, maybe, regardless of the flag or the ideology.
It seems to cut across them, doesn't it? Whether you call the system capitalist, socialist, state-controlled, whatever, that fundamental human drive for self-interest or group interest, when it's unchecked, when it's put above everything else, it can lead to remarkably similar kinds of negative outcomes.
So the labels might differ, but the pattern repeats.
Precisely. While the stated goals, the ways the systems work might look very different, the core problem often comes down to a failure of accountability, a refusal to admit when chasing profit, without strong ethical guardrails, without a sense of shared responsibility, leads to widespread suffering.
Which makes it crystal clear that admitting mistakes, holding powerful players accountable, it's not optional, is it? It's essential if we want to reduce harm, build something more sustainable, more equitable.
Absolutely essential.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
What's fascinating here is how often that immediate pull of profit, that short-term gain, can genuinely blind people, blind institutions to the much bigger, longer-term consequences.
Consequences for society, sure.
Yeah.
But even for themselves, right?
Yeah.
Undermining their own stability in the long run.
Exactly. It's like sawing off the branch you're sitting on sometimes.
So it's not just unethical. It can be strategically dumb in the long term.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ability to honestly look at yourself, admit mistakes, and adapt, that's actually a sign of strength, resilience, not weakness.
Whereas refusing to do so
Ultimately makes the system, whether it's one company or the whole global economy, much more fragile, more brittle, prone to shattering.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. We've basically explored how this refusal by powerful groups to own up to mistakes driven by profit. It has these huge interconnected global impacts.
Right.
We saw it in like the 2008 crisis, leading to instability and lost trust. We saw it fueling international tensions, even conflict over resource extraction.
Yep. Competition element.
Hindering action on climate change because of fossil fuel profits.
A massive one.
Making global inequality worse through certain trade practices, maybe linked to ideology.
The blind spots.
The immense harm caused by industries like tobacco resisting the truth for decades.
Chilling example.
And enabling exploitation through these complex responsibility-diffusing global supply chains.
Making accountability hard.
And we specifically tied this pattern to the U.S.-China relationship, how that focus on dominance or short-term gain leads to trade wars, geopolitical tension, blocking cooperation, all hitting average people globally.
Yeah, connecting the micro examples to that macro dynamic.
And the common theme, again and again, prioritizing profit over accountability. Doesn't really matter what the stated ideology is.
That seems to be the core finding, yes.
This raises an important question. Given how deeply ingrained this tendency seems to be, prioritizing profit, what can actually be done? What are some concrete steps, maybe, that individual societies, governments can take to build stronger accountability, to encourage more shared responsibility?
That is the question, isn't it? How do you shift that deep-seated incentive structure?
It's huge. Makes you think about where the levers are. What influence do we actually have, even as individuals, to push for that accountability? So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Well, maybe it just highlights how important it is to be, a more informed, more critical consumer of information, of products, of political narratives.
Questioning the surface story.
Yeah, demanding more transparency from companies, from governments, being willing to question those stories that always put profit first, above everything else. Maybe it's about rethinking what strength means. It's not about never admitting a mistake, right?
No, quite the opposite.
Maybe real strength is having the courage to say, we messed up, learn from it, and try to do better. And perhaps, just perhaps, understanding how universal this profit-driven tendency is, cutting across ideologies, maybe that can help us find some unexpected common ground to actually tackle these huge global challenges together.
That's a hopeful thought to end on, finding common ground and shared vulnerabilities.
Something to think about anyway.
This is DigitView.